What if I told you you're not weak? You're being trained to stay weak. Not by the world, not by other people, but by your own brain. And the worst part? You don't even notice it happening. Every time you try to change your life, something strange happens. You start with clarity. You feel motivated. You tell yourself, this time will be different. But then, you slow down, you delay, you drift, and eventually you end up right where you started, again. It feels like a lack of discipline. It feels like laziness. But that explanation is too simple. Because if it were just about discipline, why do so many people struggle in the exact same way? Different lives, different goals, same pattern. That's not random. That's a system. A quiet, invisible system that rewards comfort, avoids effort, and slowly trains you to stay exactly where you are. And once you see how that system works, you can't unsee it. So before you blame yourself again, before you try to fix your habits, there's something you need to understand first. Because the problem isn't what you think, and until you see it clearly, you'll keep fighting yourself and losing. Let's start Chapter 1: The Illusion of Weakness. There's a moment most people don't talk about. It usually happens late at night or early in the morning when everything is quiet and you're left alone with your thoughts. You look at your life, what you planned to do, what you said you'd become, and then you look at what you actually did. And there's a gap, a frustrating, uncomfortable gap. That's when the thought slips in. Maybe I'm just not disciplined enough. Maybe I'm lazy. Maybe something is wrong with me. It feels personal. It feels like failure. So you make a decision. Tomorrow will be different. You'll wake up early. You'll focus. You'll finally take control. And for a moment, it feels real. Motivating even. But then tomorrow comes. You wake up a little tired. You check your phone just for a minute. You tell yourself you'll start soon. And somehow hours disappear. The plan fades. The energy drops. And by the end of the day, you're right back where you started. Again. Now here's the part that matters. Most people stop the story there. They assume the pattern is proof that they lack discipline, proof that they can't change, proof that they are somehow weaker than others. But if you look a little closer, something doesn't quite add up. Because it's not just you. Millions of people go through the exact same cycle. Different goals, different lives, same pattern. They try, they slip, they blame themselves, and repeat. If this were truly about individual weakness, why does it happen so consistently? Why do so many people with completely different personalities and backgrounds struggle in almost identical ways? That question is easy to ignore, because blaming yourself is simple. It gives you a clear explanation, even if it's a painful one. I just need more discipline. It sounds logical, but it may not be true. Let's slow this down for a second. Think about the last time you tried to change something. Maybe you wanted to exercise more, or stop procrastinating, or finally focus on a goal you've been avoiding. At the start, there was energy, a kind of urgency. You saw the problem clearly, and you wanted out. But then something shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly.
Your mind started offering alternatives. Just rest today. You've had a long day. You can start tomorrow. And they didn't sound like excuses. They sounded reasonable, almost protective. And that's where things get interesting, because those thoughts didn't feel like sabotage. They felt like support, like your mind was trying to help you. But help you do what? Not grow, not improve, just stay comfortable. Now, pause there, because this is the first crack in the story you've been telling yourself. What if your mind isn't trying to make you stronger? What if it's trying to keep you safe? Safe doesn't mean successful. Safe means predictable, familiar, easy. And anything that threatens that, even if it's good for you, starts to feel uncomfortable.
So your brain steps in, not as an enemy, but as a protector. It nudges you back toward what it already knows, the habits you've repeated, the routines you've settled into, even the distractions you rely on. Because from its perspective, change is risk, and risk is something to avoid. Now, here's where most people misunderstand this. They think they're fighting laziness, but they're not. They're fighting resistance, a subtle, constant resistance that shows up whenever they try to move forward. And the worst part? It doesn't feel like resistance. It feels like you, your thoughts, your decisions, your choices. So when you fall back into old patterns, it feels like you chose it, which leads to guilt. And that guilt reinforces the original belief, I'm the problem. But what if that belief is the trap? What if the system is working exactly as it was designed to, just not in the way you expected? Look at it this way. If your brain's primary job is to keep you safe and conserve energy, then avoiding effort makes sense. If sticking to familiar patterns reduces uncertainty, then repeating them makes sense. If small, easy rewards like scrolling, watching, delaying give quick relief, then choosing them makes sense. From that perspective, you're not broken. You're consistent. Consistent with a system that values comfort over change. And once you start to see that, something shifts. The frustration doesn't disappear, but it becomes more focused, less emotional, more analytical. Because now you're not just asking, what's wrong with me? You're asking, what is this pattern doing? And that question opens a different door, one that most people never walk through. Because it's easier to stay in self-blame. It's familiar, almost comforting. If you're the problem, then the solution is simple. Just try harder. But you've already tried that, haven't you? You've pushed yourself, motivated yourself, even forced yourself at times. And it worked, briefly, until it didn't. Which brings us back to where we started. That quiet moment, that gap between who you are and who you think you should be. What if that gap isn't a sign of weakness? What if it's a signal? A signal that something deeper is shaping your behavior. Something automatic, something you didn't consciously choose. And more importantly, something you can learn to understand. Because the moment you stop seeing yourself as the enemy, you create space to see the real problem. Not clearly, not at once, but enough to question it. And that question is where change begins. Not with motivation, not with discipline, but with awareness.
So before you try to fix your habits, before you set another goal, before you promise yourself that this time will be different, ask yourself something simpler. Not, why am I like this? But, what is my mind trying to keep me from? Because the answer to that question might be the first real step out of the loop you've been stuck in. And once you start looking at your behavior through that lens, weakness doesn't look the same anymore. It starts to look like something else entirely.
Chapter 2. The Comfort Trap. There's a strange thing about comfort. At first, it doesn't feel like a trap at all. It feels like relief, like a pause after pressure, like something finally letting you breathe. You sit down for a minute and it feels harmless. You open your phone just to check something and it feels innocent. You delay your work until later and it feels reasonable. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, just small decisions, almost invisible ones. But those small moments are where something deeper begins to form. Not loudly, not suddenly, quietly. Let's look at a normal day. You wake up. There's a plan somewhere in your mind, maybe not detailed, but it exists, a direction, a sense of what should happen. Then reality enters. A notification lights up the screen. A message appears. A video starts playing automatically. You don't even decide much at first. You just respond. 10 minutes pass, then 20. Then somehow the morning is already slipping away, and you tell yourself you'll start properly after lunch. It sounds harmless when you say it, almost responsible, but something subtle has already shifted. Your brain has learned something before you even notice it. Effort is optional. Comfort is immediate. Delay is always available. And the more this pattern repeats, the less friction there is in choosing it again. Now here's the part most people miss. The brain doesn't experience your long-term goals. It doesn't feel your ambition. It doesn't sit with your future vision. It only reacts to what is immediate, what feels good now, what feels easier now, what removes discomfort now. So when you're faced with a choice, work or rest, focus or distraction, the brain doesn't calculate your future success. It calculates energy. Effort equals cost. Comfort equals reward. And over time, it starts to prefer the reward that requires nothing. Not because it hates you, but because it is efficient. Too efficient sometimes. Think about how often you don't even negotiate with yourself anymore. You just drift. You don't argue with the distraction. You don't question the delay. You simply slide into it. And that's where the trap becomes interesting, because a trap doesn't feel like force. It feels like choice. You don't feel pushed. You feel allowed. Allowed to rest, allowed to postpone, allowed to start later. And every time you accept that permission, the system becomes a little stronger. Not dramatically stronger, not suddenly noticeable, just more automatic. Until one day you realize something uncomfortable. You're not really choosing as much as you think. You're following a pattern that already knows where you'll go. Now let's slow this down, because this is where people usually misunderstand themselves. They think they lack discipline. They think they need more motivation. They think the solution is to try harder. But notice what happens when they try. They wake up one day. They push through resistance. They force productivity. It works
briefly. There's a burst of control, a short-lived sense of victory. But then something pulls them back, not dramatically, subtly. They miss one day, then another, then the old rhythm returns, and suddenly the effort feels heavier than before. Why?
Because the comfort system doesn't disappear when you challenge it. It adapts, it waits, and it becomes more persuasive the next time. It doesn't say, don't do it. It says, you can do it later. You've already done enough today. You deserve a break. And those thoughts don't feel like sabotage. They feel like care. That's the strange part. The voice that keeps you stuck doesn't sound cruel. It sounds reasonable, even kind. But kindness without direction can become a quiet form of stagnation. Now here's something important. Comfort isn't the enemy. You need it. Rest matters. Recovery matters. Mental space matters. The problem begins when comfort stops being a pause and starts becoming a default state. When temporary turns into automatic. When rest stops serving your life and starts replacing it. At that point, comfort is no longer neutral. It starts shaping your identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who gets distracted easily, someone who can't stay consistent, someone who will start tomorrow. And identity is powerful, because once you accept a label, even silently, you start acting in ways that match it, not always consciously, but consistently. So the comfort trap doesn't just affect your time, it affects your self-image. And that is where it becomes difficult to notice. Because you're not just dealing with habits anymore, you're dealing with what those habits are teaching you about yourself. Let's take a simple example. Imagine you decide to read for 30 minutes instead of scrolling. At first, it feels slightly uncomfortable. Your mind resists. It looks for exits. It suggests alternatives. You feel a small tension, not painful, just unsettled. Most people interpret that feeling as a sign. Maybe I'm not in the mood. Maybe I'll focus better later. Maybe this isn't the right time. So they stop and return to comfort. The tension disappears immediately. Relief arrives. But something important just happened. The brain learned again. Discomfort leads to exit, and exit is always available. Now repeat that pattern across days, weeks, years. What you get is not laziness in the traditional sense, it's training. A slow conditioning process where avoidance becomes the default response to friction. And eventually, even small efforts start to feel heavier than they actually are. Not because they changed, but because your tolerance changed. This is why change feels harder than it should. It's not just the task, it's the resistance built around it, layered, repeated, reinforced. And because it happens gradually, it rarely feels like something is being built. It feels like something is wrong with you. But pause for a moment here. Look at it differently. What if this isn't a personal failure? What if it's just a learned system? A system that prioritizes ease, repetition, and immediate relief. A system that never updates its priorities unless something interrupts it. Not a big interruption, not a dramatic shift, just a moment of awareness strong enough to create distance between impulse and action. That's where things start to change. Not when comfort disappears, but when it stops making decisions for you automatically. Because right now, in most moments, it's not even a decision, it's a reflex.
And reflexes can be unlearned, but only when they are seen clearly enough to be interrupted. So the real question isn't how to eliminate comfort. That's impossible. The question is something more precise. When comfort appears, do you notice it in time to choose differently? Or do you follow it before the question even forms? Because that small gap, that tiny space between impulse and response, is where everything starts to shift. And most people never even realize it exists. Not until something forces them to look closer. Not until the pattern becomes too loud to ignore. But once you see it, you don't really unsee it. And that's where the discomfort starts. Not because life becomes harder, but because staying unconscious becomes harder. And that is the beginning of the next layer.
Chapter 3: Dopamine and the Invisible Addiction. There's a reason certain moments feel harder than they should. You sit down with a plan. You know exactly what needs to be done. You even want to do it. And yet, something doesn't connect. Your hand reaches for your phone without thinking. A tab opens. A video starts. A scroll begins. No decision really happens. It just unfolds. And later, when you look back, it feels strange. How did I end up here again? That question carries frustration, but also confusion, because it doesn't feel like a choice you consciously made. It feels automatic, almost like your attention slipped away from you for a moment. Now, most people explain this in simple terms: distraction, lack of discipline, weak focus. But those words don't fully capture what's happening underneath. Something quieter is shaping the behavior, not forcing it, not commanding it, just guiding it. And that's where dopamine enters the picture. Dopamine is often misunderstood as a pleasure chemical, but that description is incomplete. It doesn't just reward pleasure, it predicts it. It creates a kind of anticipation loop, a signal that says, "This might feel good, go check." And the brain listens, not because it's weak, but because it's efficient. It prefers signals that reduce uncertainty. A notification, a new message, a short video that might be interesting. Each one becomes a small possibility of reward. Not guaranteed reward, just possibility. And that uncertainty is powerful, more powerful than certainty itself. Because the brain doesn't need certainty to act. It only needs the possibility of something rewarding. So you check, just in case. And sometimes it pays off. A funny video, a message from someone, a small burst of novelty. That moment feels harmless, even trivial. But something important is happening in the background. Your brain is learning a pattern. Cue, action, reward. Not in a dramatic way, not with alarms or warnings, just repetition, quiet reinforcement. And the more often this loop happens, the more automatic it becomes. Now here's where it gets interesting. The brain doesn't just learn that scrolling is enjoyable. It learns that uncertainty itself is worth chasing. Because sometimes there is a reward, and sometimes there is not. That unpredictable structure keeps the system alive. It creates anticipation, even when nothing is happening. You're not always enjoying the content. You're expecting it. And expectation is enough to pull you back. So even when nothing meaningful appears, the habit doesn't weaken, it strengthens. Because the brain is not evaluating quality in the way you think it is, it's evaluating potential. This is where the invisible part of addiction begins.
Not addiction in the dramatic, extreme sense people usually imagine, but something more ordinary, more subtle. A repetition loop that doesn't feel like dependence because it is woven into daily life. Checking messages, refreshing feeds, opening apps without purpose. None of it feels serious in isolation, but together it forms a rhythm your attention starts to follow without asking. And once attention is trained in this way, sustained focus begins to feel unusually heavy.
Not impossible, just heavier than it used to be. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. There's no single moment where your brain switches. Instead, it shifts through accumulation, one small reward at a time, one small escape at a time, until focus feels like effort and distraction feels like default. And here's the part most people struggle with. They assume this means something is wrong with them personally. But what if it's not personal at all? What if it's structural? Your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do: respond to signals, chase novelty, reduce uncertainty, conserve energy. The problem is not the mechanism, it's the environment it now operates in. Because modern environments don't just offer occasional stimulation, they offer constant stimulation. There is always something new, always something slightly more interesting than the task in front of you. And the brain doesn't rank importance the way long-term planning does. It ranks immediacy. So the present moment wins, even when it costs the future version of you something important. Now think about how often this plays out in small ways. You intend to start working, but first you check something quickly. You sit down to read, but a thought interrupts you. Just one video. You plan to focus, but the friction of starting feels slightly uncomfortable, so you delay it. None of these moments feel significant individually, but they add up. Not like explosions, more like erosion. Slow, continuous, hard to notice while it's happening. And that's what makes it difficult, because there is no obvious breaking point, no clear moment where you can say, this is where it started. Only a pattern that becomes visible later when you step back. And when you do, it can feel discouraging. But there's another way to interpret it, not as failure, but as conditioning, a learned response to a certain kind of environment. And if something is learned, it can be reshaped. Not quickly, not easily, but it is not fixed. Now, let's look at something more subtle. Even when you recognize the pattern, you don't always break it. You might understand exactly what's happening and still repeat it. That's the part that confuses people the most. If I know it's happening, why can't I stop it? But awareness alone doesn't override conditioning. It only creates a gap, a small one, between impulse and action. And at first, that gap is almost invisible. You feel the urge, you act, the awareness comes after. But over time, something shifts. The awareness begins to arrive slightly earlier, not enough to fully change behavior, but enough to create hesitation, a pause. And in that pause, something important becomes possible, a choice that wasn't there before. Not a dramatic choice, life-changing choice, just a small interruption in the loop. And that interruption is where the system begins to weaken, because habits don't require force to sustain themselves. They require continuity. Break the continuity often enough, and the pattern starts to lose its automatic grip. But this is where most people give up, because they expect immediate change. They expect awareness to feel powerful right away. It usually doesn't. It feels small, almost insignificant, like nothing has really changed. But that perception is misleading, because the real shift is not in behavior yet, it's in observation. You start noticing the loop instead of only living inside it.
You see the moment before the scroll, the pause before the distraction, the suggestion before the action. And once you can see it clearly enough, it stops being invisible. And what is no longer invisible becomes harder to justify. Not impossible, just harder. And that is where the process actually begins. Not with control, not with force, but with recognition of how easily attention can be pulled away without permission. And once that recognition settles in, the next layer becomes unavoidable.
Chapter 4. Why Change Feels So Hard. There's a particular kind of frustration that doesn't show up when things are failing completely. It shows up when you're almost changing. You try to wake up earlier. For a few days it works, then it slips. You try to focus more deeply. It feels possible at first, then it starts to feel heavier. You try to cut distractions. You even manage a few clean hours until something pulls you back. And every time the question returns in the same quiet tone. Why is this so hard for me? That question sounds simple, but it carries a lot underneath it. Doubt, comparison, and a slow erosion of confidence. Most people don't notice how quickly it turns inward. Not, this is difficult, but I am the reason this is difficult. And that shift matters more than it seems. Because once the struggle becomes personal, every attempt to change carries extra weight. You're no longer just trying to do something new, you're also trying to prove something about yourself. Now here's where the confusion deepens. You can change, at least temporarily. That's what makes it so frustrating. There are moments when everything aligns. You feel sharp, focused, almost effortless. Work gets done. Habits feel stable. There's a quiet satisfaction in it. Then it fades. Not dramatically, not with warning signs. It just loosens. A missed morning, a slightly longer break, a harmless distraction that doesn't feel like a turning point at all. And somehow that's enough to pull everything back. It creates a strange contradiction. You've seen yourself do better, so you know it's possible. But you've also seen how quickly it dissolves, so you start doubting whether it's sustainable. That tension is where most people get stuck. But to understand it properly, you have to look at what change actually demands from the mind. Change is not just about doing something different. It is about interrupting a pattern that already knows how to run itself. Your daily behavior isn't random. It's built from repetition. Small decisions that have been rehearsed so many times they no longer feel like decisions. You don't decide to reach for your phone in a detailed, conscious way. You simply notice the impulse after your hand is already moving. You don't carefully weigh the decision to delay work. It appears as a reasonable thought almost instantly. That speed matters, because anything that happens faster than reflection begins to feel like identity rather than choice. And identity is sticky. When something feels like, this is just how I am, it becomes harder to challenge without discomfort. So when you try to change, you are not only introducing a new behavior, you are also interfering with something that has become automatic, efficient, and deeply familiar. And the mind doesn't give that up easily. Not because it is resisting growth in a moral sense, but because it prefers predictability. Predictability reduces internal effort. It avoids uncertainty. It keeps things stable, even if stability is not what you consciously want. That's where the resistance shows up. Not as a clear voice saying, don't change, but as small adjustments that feel reasonable in the moment. You can start after this. You're not in the right state right now. You'll do it properly tomorrow. Each thought feels almost helpful, almost practical. It doesn't oppose change directly. It delays it just enough for the old pattern to continue. And the old pattern doesn't need force. It only needs time.
Now, something else happens during this process that often gets overlooked. When change fails repeatedly, people don't just return to old habits. They also start to lose trust in their ability to sustain effort. That loss is subtle, but it accumulates. You begin to expect interruption. You begin to anticipate distraction. You begin to assume inconsistency before it even happens. And once expectation shifts, behavior tends to follow it. Not immediately, but gradually. This is why trying harder often stops working after a point, because effort alone doesn't address expectation. It doesn't interrupt the underlying prediction the mind is making about what you will do next. So even strong motivation can collapse back into the same pattern if nothing else changes in how the cycle is recognized. But there's an important detail here that often gets missed in self-reflection. The resistance you feel when trying to change is not constant. It varies. It appears stronger at some moments and weaker at others. Sometimes you can push through it without much difficulty. Other times it feels unusually heavy. That inconsistency is important because it suggests the resistance is not fixed. It is responsive. It reacts to context, energy, timing, and emotional state, which means it is not simply who you are. It is a process, and processes can be observed. For example, there is often a brief moment right before avoidance, a small transition, not dramatic enough to be obvious, but noticeable once you start paying attention. A pause before action, a micro-hesitation, a shift from intention to uncertainty. Most people move through it instantly without noticing it exists, but that moment is where the direction of the entire behavior is decided. Not in the long-term plan, not in the motivation, but in that small, almost invisible transition. And because it happens so quickly, it feels like there was no choice involved at all. That illusion is part of why change feels so difficult. It hides the point where intervention is actually possible. If everything feels automatic, then everything feels fixed. And if it feels fixed, effort turns into struggle rather than adjustment. But when that moment becomes visible, even slightly, something shifts in how you relate to your own behavior. You start to see that the difficulty is not evenly spread across the day. It is concentrated in specific points, moments where the old pattern attempts to take over again. And those moments are not overmountable, they're just fast, too fast to catch with attention. So the real challenge of change is not intensity, it is recognition. Recognizing the exact point where one path is chosen over another before it fully solidifies into action. And that recognition does not arrive all at once. It develops gradually through repetition of awareness rather than force of will, which means something uncomfortable but important. You don't become someone who changes in a single decision. You become someone who notices the decision being made again and again. And slowly, that noticing begins to matter more than the automatic pull that follows. Not immediately, but enough to start altering the direction of things.
Chapter 5. Breaking the Pattern. At some point, something changes. Not in your behavior, not immediately, but in the way you see it. You begin to notice the loop while it's happening, not after, not in hindsight, right there in the middle of it. You reach for your phone, and for a split second, you catch it. You feel the urge to delay, and you see it forming. You start drifting, and something inside you quietly says, "This again." It's subtle, easy to ignore, but it's different from before. Because earlier, the pattern ran without interruption. Now, it hesitates. And that hesitation matters more than it seems.
Most people expect change to feel dramatic, like a surge of motivation, a strong decision, a clear break from the past. But real change rarely announces itself like that. It starts quietly, as awareness, as interruption, as a slight delay between impulse and action. And at first, it feels almost useless. You notice the urge and still follow it. You see the pattern and still repeat it. That's where the frustration builds again. If I can see it, why am I still doing it? But this is where most people misunderstand the process. Seeing the pattern is not the end of it. It's the beginning. Because for the first time, the behavior is no longer invisible. And what is visible can be interrupted. Not perfectly, not every time, but enough to begin weakening the loop. Let's slow this down. Imagine the pattern as a path in a forest. At first, it's clear and easy to walk. You've taken it hundreds of times. Your feet know where to go without thinking. Now imagine trying to step off that path, not to create a new one yet, just to pause, to stand still for a moment before moving. It feels unnatural. There's no clear direction, no immediate reward, just a quiet discomfort. Most people step right back onto the familiar path because it's easier, but occasionally they don't. They pause just a little longer. They sit with the discomfort instead of escaping it. And in that moment, something small but important happens. The pattern doesn't complete itself. It doesn't reach its usual end. There's no quick reward, no relief, just space. And that space is where the system begins to change. Because habits depend on completion. Cue, action, reward. Break that chain even briefly, and the reinforcement weakens. Not instantly, but gradually. Now here's something important. You don't need to replace the habit immediately. You don't need a perfect alternative. At this stage, interruption is enough. Just not following the automatic path is already a shift. Because the brain expects continuity. It expects the loop to finish. When it doesn't, something feels off, uncomfortable, incomplete. That discomfort is not failure. It's the absence of the usual reward. And that absence is necessary, because without it, the system never adjusts. So instead of asking, how do I stop this completely? The better question becomes, can I delay this just for a moment? Not forever, not even for an hour. Just long enough to notice what's happening without immediately acting on it. That delay creates friction, and friction slows down automatic behavior. Even a few seconds of pause can change the direction of the moment. Now, let's make this practical. You feel the urge to check your phone. Instead of immediately giving in, you pause. You don't fight it aggressively. You don't shame yourself. You just wait. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. You watch the urge instead of becoming it. Sometimes you'll still give in. That's fine. The goal is not perfection, it's interruption. And over time, those small interruptions start to accumulate. Not in a visible way at first, but in the background. The pattern becomes less smooth, less automatic, more noticeable. And that changes your relationship with it. You're no longer fully inside it, you're observing it. And observation creates distance. Now, here's where things get interesting. Once distance appears, choice becomes clearer. Not easy, but clearer. You begin to see two paths instead of one, the familiar one and the uncomfortable alternative. And that alternative doesn't always look appealing. It feels slower, requires more effort, offers delayed results. But it also carries something the other path doesn't: direction. And that's where the shift begins. Not because the new path feels better, but because it starts to feel intentional. You're no longer drifting, you're choosing. Even if the choice is small, even if it only lasts a few minutes, that moment matters. Because it introduces a different kind of reward, not immediate pleasure, but a quiet sense of control. Subtle, easy to overlook, but real. And that feeling begins to compete with the old reward system, not by overpowering it, but by existing alongside it. Now, this doesn't mean the struggle disappears. In fact, sometimes it feels stronger because you're more aware of it. You notice the pull more clearly. The urge feels louder. But that's not because it's stronger. It's because you're no longer ignoring it. And awareness changes the experience. Before, the loop felt natural. Now it feels visible, almost exposed. And once something is exposed, it loses part of its control. Not all of it, but enough to create movement. Slow movement, but real. So the goal here is not to eliminate the pattern overnight. It's to disrupt its rhythm, to create small breaks in continuity, to introduce hesitation where there was none before. And through that hesitation, the system begins to loosen, not collapse, not disappear, but loosen. And in that loosened state, something new can begin to take shape.
Chapter 6. Taking Back Control. At some point, the question changes. It's no longer, why can't I change? It becomes, what is actually in my control? That shift is subtle, but it marks the beginning of something different. Because for most of this journey, it felt like you were fighting yourself, your habits, your impulses, your lack of consistency. It felt internal, personal, like something inside you needed to be fixed. But now, after seeing the patterns, the loops, the way your mind responds to comfort and reward, it doesn't feel exactly the same anymore. Not easier, but clearer. And clarity changes how you move. Because control, real control, doesn't come from force. It doesn't come from pushing harder every time you feel resistance. That approach burns out quickly. You've probably felt that already. Moments where you forced discipline, held it together for a while, then slowly slipped back into the same patterns. That cycle isn't a lack of strength. It's a mismatch. Force is temporary. Understanding lasts longer. So instead of trying to dominate the mind, you start working with it. Not by agreeing with every impulse, but by recognizing how those impulses form. You begin to notice when your energy drops, when your attention becomes unstable, when your environment makes distraction easier than focus. And instead of blaming yourself for reacting, you start adjusting what surrounds you. Because control is not just internal, it's structural. The spaces you spend time in, the tools you keep within reach, the habits you allow to repeat without question. All of these shape your behavior before you even think about it. So rather than relying on willpower alone, you reduce friction where it matters. You make focus slightly easier. You make distraction slightly harder. You remove unnecessary decisions that drain your attention. Not perfectly, just enough to shift the balance. Because small shifts repeated consistently begin to change direction. Now, something else starts to happen. You stop expecting yourself to be perfect. That expectation was part of the trap. The idea that change should feel clean, linear, and controlled.
but it rarely does.
There are still days where the old patterns return. Still moments where the loop completes itself. Still times when awareness comes too late. And that used to mean failure. Now, it means something else. It becomes feedback, not emotional, not heavy, just information. A signal that something in the system pulled you back. And instead of reacting with frustration, you get curious. What triggered it? What made the pattern easier to follow? Where did the awareness break? Those questions don't punish you. They refine your understanding. And over time, that understanding becomes more valuable than short bursts of discipline, because it allows you to adapt, quietly, without pressure. Now here's the part that matters most. Control doesn't arrive as a feeling. It doesn't show up as constant motivation. It appears in small, almost unremarkable moments. When you pause instead of reacting. When you choose to continue instead of stopping. When you notice the urge and don't immediately follow it. Those moments don't look impressive. No one else sees them. They don't feel dramatic. But they accumulate. And slowly they begin to shift your identity. Not through words, but through repetition. You start to see yourself differently. Not as someone who is stuck. Not as someone who can't stay consistent. But as someone who is learning to respond differently. That identity is quieter, less fragile, because it's based on observation, not expectation. And over time, something stabilizes. Not perfectly, but noticeably. Your attention holds a little longer. Your reactions slow down slightly. Your choices feel a bit more deliberate. And the old patterns, they don't disappear, but they lose their authority. They stop feeling inevitable. They become options. And that changes everything. Because once something is an option, it can be declined. Not always easily, not always consistently, but consciously. And conscious choice is where control actually lives. Not in removing difficulty, but in deciding how to respond to it. So no, your brain didn't suddenly become your enemy. It was never trying to destroy you. It was trying to protect you in a way that no longer fits the life you want. And now, for the first time, you're starting to see that clearly. Not as a theory, but as something you've experienced. Moment by moment, choice by choice. And that awareness, that quiet, steady awareness, is what allows you to move forward differently. Not perfectly, but intentionally. And that's enough. More than enough. Because control was never about becoming someone else. It was about finally understanding what was shaping you, so you could begin shaping it back.